Thank you very much. Ja, dessvärre kan jag inte prata svenska. Men, det går bedre med dansk. Men dansk det är inte gott nog här. Så jag talar på engelsk. Yeah. Well, I am going to talk about apparitions. And we associate apparitions with hallucinations, with visions, with spökeri, and with mental illness. And we generally feel very skeptical about phenomena of that kind. First, because of the association with mental illness or things related to that, and also because if apparitions appear sort of to someone in a normal state or would happen to us, we would basically doubt it, because physical reality is very firm and fixed, and we are great believers in it for good reasons. So if anything else happens, we and most people meet it with great skepticism and probably even do not want to believe it. But if we look at the research that has been done, then we find that there is evidence that such phenomena really happen. It is not only in the literature, like in the Bible, in the sagas, or in Shakespeare, that we find apparitions. If we make surveys, we will also find some. And if we look up the old literature of the British Society for Psychical Research and look at the Phantasms of the Living, these big 2 volumes, they publish in detail a great number of them. And they made an effort to investigate these cases. Well, I had some interest in this, but what caused it was yeah, this is a bit wrong, something. Something is missing here, but not on the screen. Yeah.
Our master hacker.
Yes, yes. But what made me particularly interested is that I made a survey in Iceland in 1965 about paranormal or psychic experiences in the general population, and it was a very large-scale survey. We had 1102, that's missing, 1102, a sample of 1102, and it was a random sample taken from the grown-up population. And we sent them a long questionnaire, and we received in the end 902 answered questions. It's a very good turnout, but we also worked very hard, and we connected people, contacted those who had not sent in their responses. So when we analyzed all this data, we found that there were...
Can you do the text smaller on this data?
This is psychic dreams, but part is missing. Yes, anyway, psychic dreams were most commonly reported. And that were dreams that were people believed were either precognitive or even clairvoyant, who dreams that brought some knowledge to people they were not supposed to know about. And then the second thing was apparition of a dead person, namely feeling that, or having had the experience of sensing a person who had died. That was reported by 31%. And that I was really very surprised about. I didn't think it would be anything like that. There was also a difference here between men and women. It was more common among the women. More than every third woman had the experience, but about every fourth man. So this made me, very curious, and I wanted to know more. So I decided to interview 100 persons of those who claimed to have had an appearance, had an experience of a dead person, and asked them what was the experience, what did they observe, what made them think that this was an experience of a dead person. So, this is not really. Yes, the question here: have you ever, in a waking state, perceived or felt the presence of a deceased or dead person? So that was the basic question. And 31% of that sample of 302 answered yes to that question. So
I would not be able to do anything without interrupting.
Yes. Why don't you interrupt and do it?
Okay, so I don't know exactly how it's working, but I'll try.
Yeah. So we decided to interview all persons who had answered these questions with a yes in the Reykjavik area and in Akureyri, another town. And we were able to interview 129 persons. And from these 129, we obtained 100 cases where people claimed that they had perceived, mostly seen, a person they believed or they knew that was dead. And then we asked also many other questions about it, not only how the person was perceived, but also under what circumstances, for how long, how did the person appear, how did she disappear, was it someone they knew well, was it a relative, was it a stranger or a friend, and many, many questions. I think there were about 40 of them. Yes. Well, now we come to another thing. It doesn't matter really. There was in the early 80s, there was conducted a survey in most Western countries, most countries of Western Europe. It was called the European Human Value Study. That study dealt with politics, with social issues, with religion, with work and work ethics, and it was conducted in most countries of Western Europe to find out how far are the Europeans all alike, and in how far do they differ. And in this large survey, there were 3 questions on paranormal experiences. And they were questions first conceived by Andrew Greeley, an American sociologist and priest, by the way. And one of these questions was, have you ever felt that you were really in touch with someone who had died? And I was involved with the study in Iceland, not because of the paranormal items in it. I knew nothing about them when I started. So I got access.
He's a little bit smaller and draw this apparatus back.
Sorry.
Det måste väl göra...
Det elektroniska projektor, det fungerar på annat sätt. I'm sorry, I think, I hope you can manage. I don't know this machine.
No. Yeah. Well, anyway, when I looked at the results of this European survey, Iceland was highest for having felt in touch with someone who had died. The question was repeated more than once. I will not go into that. But so it varied from 31% to 41%. Then,
How does the countdown in it?
yes. Then I think this is Finland was 14%, Sweden 14%, Denmark 10%, and Norway 9%. And if we look at the other European countries, Italy 34%, Germany 28%, Great Britain 26%, France 24%, and Belgium 28%. But there was another country, that was Spain 16%, and West Europe as a whole, every fourth person interviewed, and these were a large sample, representative samples from all over Europe. This survey was conducted by Gallup and Gallup affiliated companies. And every fourth man had felt or stated he had felt that he or she was really in touch with someone who had died. That was a very common experience, every fourth person, for Europeans as a whole. And in the United States, it was 30 to 41%. It was repeated 3 times in the state. So the Americans and the Icelanders, they have a similar, they're about the same number of people report experiences of this kind. And then after them are the Italians, every third man. So,
and the last one is that Norge or Sverige?
This is Sverige is 14 and Norge is 9. Yes. Yeah. Well, I was going to show you here. In the same survey, it was asked, "Do you believe in life after death?" And here are the figures. Iceland was also highest among the Scandinavian countries. This survey was repeated again in 1990 and in 2000, but without the paranormal items. But the belief questions were there. And you see here Sweden, in 80 it was 28% who believed in life after death. In 1990 it was 38%. And in 2046, so it seems there have been a tendency in Sweden to believe more in survival. And you find that in a little bit in Denmark, Sweden, Norway only took part in these two, and so on. Well, anyway, this is in the various countries, but you see here, in the United States, 78%, similar to the Icelanders. Then I decided to make a bigger study, not only 100 cases, but rather with many more cases, because with 100 cases you cannot do that much of an analysis, because the cases were of many different kinds. So I wanted to get a lot more. We had these 100 cases from 75, and then I had a little leaflet placed in 4 popular magazines and asked if they had ever felt they were in touch with that person, and asked them if they had seen, heard, or only felt the presence, and so on. And we had a greater response than we could deal with. So in the end, we interviewed about 350 persons. Or we interviewed some more, and some we just threw away because it really was not a sensory experience, and we thought it was really too thin to accept. But in the end, we got about 350 cases here. So we have a total of 450. So that is how this sample came about. Then first about these experiences. Now we have something missing here. This is visual. How common was it that people saw a dead person, that they reported to have seen someone? And we had 518 when we only saw, but there was no other modality, no report of hearing the person or anything like that. So, and then some of them were not only seeing but also hearing or feeling a smell or feeling a touch or something like that. So we have 303 cases where there is a visual component, there's a experience of seeing, and that was 67% of all the cases, these 449. So if we define apparitions narrowly, namely only as figures that are seen, then we have 303 and they are 60%, 67%. But there were also others. There was also auditory, namely hearing a voice or hearing a noise that was characteristic for a particular person. Yes, I wanted to read to you some of these few of these cases. For example, one here. Let me read one visual case. It is reported by a woman. I sat in my bedroom and was reading. She sat in a chair in her bedroom. Then I looked up and saw in front of me my grandmother. She was like alive, smiling and happy looking. And then she just disappeared. And then the next morning I told this to my mother, and then she said, that was nice. She had a birthday yesterday, but both of them had forgotten about it. So that's one. Then here is another one. I was 15 or 16 years old, and I was working in a factory at a piece of machine. And then one day, there passes the machine in front of me, a man, and disappears around the corner, so he couldn't see. But it was not a way for people to walk, so he looked around, and there was no one there, and there was no door, so the man had disappeared. And then he mentioned this to the people working with him and described the man. And then they said, this is the former owner of this company, or what do you say, workshop, and he had committed suicide. So that was the solution to that. And then there is one here about a man who had lost his father rather recently. He had been sleeping in his bed and woke up, and he feels that there is someone at his side. And he then looks there, and there he sees his father just like at his side in the bed. And he sees his shirt, how he was dressed, and so on. But then his grandfather gets out of the bed, walks towards a door that was there in the room. So he sees his back, but while the grandfather was alive, he lived in that room. But as he walks towards that door, he raises his hand and points toward a clock that was standing at the wall, like a Bornholm clock, these big clocks. And then he came to the door and disappeared. And then this man told us that he found this, that he raised his arm and looked and pointed towards the clock. Very interesting, because he had promised to his father to bring that clock to his brother, but he had neglected it. So that was sort of a reminder he felt from his father to bring the clock really to his brother. So these were two.
Did you do so?
I think we did, yes. Yes, and maybe I may read one more. It is by a woman who had lost a son. And she was washing the wooden floor in her living room when she looked up for a moment to pause. Then she saw, standing rather near to her, his deceased boy, the boy who had died. She looked at him for a while and didn't realize that he had died. She was so sure. She saw his boy there and her boy. And then she stood up and ran towards him and said, "My Becky." But Becky was his name. But then he disappeared. And he was dressed, she told, in the clothes he used to wear when he drowned, but he had drowned. And that was it. So this is the kind of reports that we may get. There were quite a fair number of these auditory, these visual experiences. Well, I'm still with the visual, yes. Then there was a fair number of these auditory experiences, namely of hearing someone who had died, or hearing a noise that was characteristic for someone who had died. And I will read one here. It's from a fisherman. He was on a boat out fishing, and then suddenly he hears a voice to let the line go and row immediately ashore. And he was surprised. This was said in a very demanding voice, so he decided to do it. And he goes into, I think this was Siglufjord, one of these narrow fjords in the north of Iceland, and he rows ashore. And just as he has entered the fjord, is coming to the harbor, then there breaks out a violent storm, very unexpectedly, and he just managed to get into the harbor. And he feels that this saved him from great difficulties, if not saved his life. And he didn't, when he had the experience, recognize the voice, but later he thought it was his brother who had drowned some time earlier. So this is one. Then about 58% of these auditory experiences are voices, but 42, the rest of them, are some noises that are characteristic for a particular deceased person. And here is one. This happened, I said here, written here, this happened shortly after my father died, and I and my brother, we went to our father's house. He had been, in the end, living alone in the house. It was a small old house with a floor on the ground and a little upper floor. And as we open the door, we hear him walking upstairs. And we knew his way of walking so well, it just heard exactly like his way of walking. And we stopped there, and both of us listened. And I said to my brother, "There's no doubt who was there." But then we went upstairs, and there was no one in the house. Well, this is a case where more than one person has the experience. So whenever we had such a case, we would interview that person if it was possible for us to find that person. And we did, and we interviewed the brother of that man independently. And he told us he remembered this case very well. They went, both of them, to the house. They opened the door, and they heard the old man upstairs, and they listened to him for a while, and then we went inside and up into the upper floor, and there was no one there. So we get some cases that are where there is more than one observer. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, do you have any figure of how many cases?
Yes, I come to that later.
Yeah, okay.
Well, then there were also, well, this is a bit of a mess here. This is auditory. This is one is, this is touch.
Reset the screen. with a different on the computer?
Pardon me?
Why don't you try to reset the screen with a different resolution?
I am not such a computer expert. I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. But I have used this computer with other pieces of equipment, and it has worked perfectly. This is the first time this doesn't work. So I suspect there's something wrong with this equipment. But I also have some. Transparency. Well, anyway, there were also some cases of touch. Well, maybe this is olfactory. Maybe I take them first. There were also some cases, like 5%, of smell, olfactory cases, and some of them very interesting. I will read 2 or 3. I was living in.
May I throw in just a quickie?
Yeah.
When it comes to instrumentational discoveries, did anybody photograph? Report that they are taking
an
pictures.
apparition?
Yes.
No, I
The same. Happened to have a camera with them.
No. Unfortunately,
There are some photos in the literature over years.
Yes. No. Well, of course, that is the weakness of the whole thing. That most of these experiences are by individuals. There is no other witness, and there are all sorts, various kinds of errors possible. You may just see someone, and it's a different person you see in the person than there is there, or you may just it's a bit like a fantasy, or someone is so vividly in your mind that he gets out there. There are various reasons possible. So I think. For each case, you can probably always come up with some sort of an explanation. But the question is that the right explanation? There may be many explanations, and I will come later to some characteristics of this phenomenon as a whole that are difficult to explain away, or are at least problematic for their explanation when it comes to the explanation. But anyway, let me take one here about smell. There's a lady, she tells, we had recently moved to Sandgerði. It's a village in the southwest of Iceland, fishing village. I was alone at home. My husband was working. Then I see suddenly there comes a man into the house. Evidently the door was open. He walks past her and into another room, and then she feels a great smell of alcohol, which she told me she never uses. And then when her husband comes home, he also feels a smell of alcohol and asked, who was here today? Why is the smell of alcohol? And then she told him no one was here today, but they had this strange experience of a man passing through and this feeling of a smell of alcohol. Well, then the next day, her husband comes home again, and then he says, now I understand why we had this experience of alcohol yesterday. Erling, that's the name, Erling, from whom we bought the house, he is reported missing in Siglufjord in the north of Iceland. But this Erling, he was an alcoholic. He was a seaman, but also a bit alcoholic. And then later he was found in the harbor, and he had evidently fallen into the harbor or drowned himself the day when they had this experience. So the day after the experience, there comes the explanation. So they thought this feeling of alcohol, smell of alcohol, comes because that man died in Siglufjörður on that particular day, and they bought the house from him. It had been his house. So that is one. Then there also, here's one about a man, a widower, who had lost his wife rather recently. And then one day he feels a strong smell of perfume, of the perfume that his wife used. And it suddenly comes up, very vivid feeling of this particular perfume. And without him finding any evident reason for it, why there was this strong feeling of perfume. And he then believed that this was a sign from his wife that she was there and that she was sort of some kind of consolation for him. And this was an experience of a widower, but there is probably no group that has more commonly experiences of a deceased person than widows and widowers, because there are probably about half of them experience sometime some sort of something that they believe is contact with their deceased husband or wife. And there was a survey done in England, in Wales, in the whole district of Wales. I think it was in the maybe 50s, 60s, by one Rees, who was at the University of London. And he interviewed all available widows and widowers in one particular district of Wales. And he got most of them. And about half of them reported some experience that they believed was an experience of their deceased spouse. Yeah.
I wonder if these seeings or olfactory hearings and smellings are it happens only once or twice, or does these people see it very often there?
Well, I think some may happen a few times, but most of these experiences they happen like once, or some people have had 2 or 3 or more experiences, so it varies. Yes. So widows and widowers are a group that reports a lot of experiences, and we are not checked it in Iceland. It is in Britain. It has also been investigated in America. It's the same. Almost half widows and widowers feel convinced that they have had contact with their dead spouse. Well, then there are cases of touch, of feeling touched by someone who had died. And these are, well, not uncommon. And we, of course, got a number of them, altogether 60 cases. Some of them were also associated with some other modality, but there were 18 cases with only this sense of smell. And I will read one to you. This happened the night after my husband died. I was alone and I was alone at home and very lonely. Suddenly I feel that he stands next to my bed. And this is also with some seeing also. And he looked like a little in a mist. And he comes and he places his hand on my head, and I feel it very, very clearly. And then he says in words, he goes through a brief poem, and that is about, it is good to rest and wake up someday with eternity all around you. It's a well-known poem in Icelandic. So she took this as an experience of consolation, but the touching part was very, very, very clear. Well, there are many of these. Then there are also a number of cases. No, sorry. Yeah, of only feeling of presence No, now something more is missing. Well, there should be.
It was there previously, maybe.
Well, this is a spooky machine.
If you go to
There was some. There are also some cases, 49 of them, of only feeling a presence. That people were very convinced that that person was with them, but there was no sensory experience. Usually, we didn't admit this to our group, to our collection. But since there were quite a number of them, we took those that sort of seemed more impressive and included them. But they are, strictly speaking, not apparitional cases. Well, I will read here one. I was traveling to the north of Iceland, and was going to visit my grandfather. And I was in no hurry, and I had decided to spend a night on the way at Blanda. That's a small town. And I was in fact going to stay there 2 days. But suddenly I felt that my grandfather was standing beside me. He said it was a very clear impression. I was just convinced my grandfather was suddenly there. So I went to the telephone office and phoned his home. And then I was told he had just died. So that was for him quite a remarkable experience. Well, we have quite a few of this, and maybe I read one here. I lost my boy, or my young boy, not really young, I'm grown up, but a young man, in 1978-79. Then one night, yes, when he is still alive, he came and as he came to my bed and asked if he wanted to go through me somehow. He sensed him so strongly that he was going through me, or through him. And he had very great heartbeat and got very sort of excited and restless and so on. So he woke up his wife, and they went to the kitchen. And when he passed through the living room where the picture of the sun was, he almost fainted. His knees gave in and he could barely make it to the kitchen. Then they had some coffee and they talked about it, and he felt something dreadful was happening. So he went to a room where his children, he had more children, were sleeping, thought that something might be wrong there, but there was nothing there. And but then the next morning they are informed that their son had just drowned that night. He had been on a boat and he drowned very unexpectedly. Well, in this case we have the man who reported this and then his wife. So we also interviewed independently his wife and asked him about this, if she had experienced anything. And she told us that her husband had waken her up in the night. He had been very sort of excited and unruly or feeling miserable. And they had gone to the kitchen and so on and so forth. They really described it much the same as her husband. And then they learned the following day that their son had drowned. Well, this is also a case where, well, this is not really an order I like. Well, sometimes I go a bit ahead of myself. Well, anyway, what I was going to say here, this is a case of where the experience takes place at the same time that someone is dying. And these cases were first investigated by the British in the late 19th century, and they found quite a number of them. There were disproportionately many of these cases, and the same came up in my study in Iceland, that there were quite a number of these cases where people had experience of someone about the time when he or she died. Yes. Then we asked every respondent about what they were doing at the time of this experience of the apparition. And then we found that about half of them were actively doing something, they were working, they were busy, and so on, in about 50% of the cases. And about 20% of them had been resting, they had just been sitting or not doing anything. 6% had been about to go to sleep. They had been in bed, they were preparing to go to sleep. And 6%, yes. And 16% had just wakened up. That was rather nuts compared to falling asleep. And there are some interesting cases of that kind. Well, I think I already told you more or less two of them. Yes. Yes, and this is grief at the death of the appearer. No, sorry, this is not that. Yes, if they had grieved the person who died when he died, and this is about cases that happened when someone perceived after he had died. Yes, who were those who appeared? And relatives, about half of them were relatives. Fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers, and so on, or sons and daughters. I will come back to that. And then friends, there were quite a few of them, and co-workers, people that the person who had the experience had been working with. And then acquaintances, 12%. And then something surprisingly, strangers, unknown people were 26%. About fourth of those who were perceived were strangers, someone people didn't know, or they just sort of barely knew, or they even came to know afterwards who had been, like from the description they were giving, like the man who was working with a machine in a factory, and he gave the description of the person he saw to his co-workers, and then it became clear to them who this person had been. So these were 26%. Yes. Then about the relatives, they were grandfathers, 43 of them. We don't have that about all the cases. We only had it for some part of it. But so there were grandfathers, grandmothers. No, they were fathers, sorry. There were fathers, there were mothers, there were grandfathers, there were grandmothers, and there were spouses. Widows perceiving their husbands, 18 cases. Widowers perceiving their wives, 9 cases, and so on. When you look at this, you notice that there are more fathers than there are mothers. And there are more grandfathers than there are grandmothers. Yes, and there are more widows who perceive their husbands than there are widowers who perceive their wives. But of course, there are many more widows than there are widowers, so that might explain it.
So this is the situation on Iceland?
Yes, it is the Icelandic situation.
Is it specific, you think?
I rather think it's valid in other countries too. but I am not sure. Here we decided, here we analyze the gender of the person that's being seen. There were 305 males, but there were only 130 females. So 70% of the apparitions are males, 30% are females. And if we break it down, and I thought perhaps that the women see more men, but it is the same. The males see this same. They see mostly males and then women, and the same for the women. They see mostly men but fewer women. So there's a great sex difference. So apparitions or ghosts are mostly males. so a joke that maybe the men also rule in the other world, because
women became angels instead of ghosts.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. What did she say?
So become a ghost, you became an angel. Men become ghosts.
Ghosts, but women become angels. Ah, that's a good explanation.
No more discussions needed.
Well, anyway, then, this is just about the apparitions were of all ages, from young children to people in their 80s and 90s. So nothing important here. But then we asked always, how did the person die? Did they die by disease, or did they die by accident? Did they commit suicide? Were they killed? And so on. And then we found out that the age of those who died by disease was 60. That was the mean age. But of those who died violently was 36. Well, that's no surprise here, but that's the way it is. Yes. And this is the age of the cases. I mean, the greatest number of them is like from the last 4 or 5 years, but we have also cases that are about 80 years old that happened to old people that we interviewed who were quite young as children even when the case happened. Yes. This is how much time passed from the death of the person till the experience took place. And we had 18 cases where the person that was perceived was died apparently exactly at the same time that the experience took place. Namely, the death and the experience coincided perfectly. That is 7%. And then how many died within 1 day? And there were further 7%. So about 40% of all the cases die within a day, or the experience take place within a day from the time the person dies. And then, this is just a breakdown. Yes. And about half of the cases concern persons who died within the last year. So most of the apparitions concern recently died persons. Yes, this is in further 21%, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 8, and longer. Yeah, but this is a remarkable thing. Why do 40% of the cases occur on the day that someone dies? This is something that the British researchers of the SPR, they discovered. They found out this great number of cases that occur on that day. And they argued that this really shouldn't happen, For example, we have a total of let's take our 450 cases, 350 cases. There we have about the same number of cases as there are days in the year. So among these 350 cases, we should have one case, if they were normally distributed across all days of the year, we should have had one case that falls on the day a person dies. But there are 14 of them, 14 times what should occur by chance. And this is one thing about apparitions that has caused great discussion among the British members of the British SPR in the 1880s and 90s and so on. And it is still not clear. Why do we have so many cases at the time someone dies? And this came through here also. Then here is the cause of death. Here we find that 70% of these who are seen or witnessed of the apparitions, they have died by disease. 30% have died violently, namely by accident, suicide, or murder. And this is particularly true for the men. There, among the men, 38% have died violently, but fewer of the women. Yeah. Here we have the percentage of our apparitions with different causes of death, and here is the percentage of the population that died from the same causes of death. In Iceland, or in the years, I took this for comparison, 1941 to 70, 91.3% of the population died from diseases. 7.1% died from accidents, 1.5% from suicide, and 0.1% was murdered. So, but when we look at our population of apparitions, we see a very different figure. There, 70.5% died naturally, versus 91% in the population. Of those who died by accidents, there were 23% among the apparitions, 7% in the population, and those who died suicide, there were 5% of them in our population of apparitions, but there is only 1.5 among the general population. So this is something that also doesn't fall into that sort of randomness. It is different. And what is really surprising is this high percentage of those who die violently by accident. And this, I think, was not noticed by the British, because in the old days they didn't have as good databases as we have. They didn't analyze the data as easily as we can do. So they didn't notice this, as far as I am able to tell. But Stevenson did. Stevenson had noticed among his cases of reincarnation of children who speak about a past life, the high incidence of violent deaths. There it is 3/4, 70, 80%. So he decided to analyze the cases in the phantasms of the living, and then he found that 28% of those where the cause of death was given had in fact died a violent death. So that was it. And this is verified by me. Here in the Icelandic data, it is 29.5% they die violently. Yeah.
But this may be, I think, a very natural psychological explanation, because when a person dies by an accident, the subject who sees the apparition is not prepared for this, but when the person dies, he or she is often sick a long time before, and this is not such a shock.
Well, there may be psychological reasons for this bias here. So that's one explanation.
The same thing, a similar interpretation may be given to why so many apparitions occur the same day or the same hours.
Well, this is also much related to the man and why we have so many of these. Shall I just a moment. I have quite a few, but I think let me see. Just a moment. Yes. Well, anyway, let me just point out that this large figure here of 70% being males, 30% females, this is to a large extent explained by the fact that many, many more men die by violent means than women. 12% of men in that 41 to 70 died of violent death, and only 3.3% of the women. So that explains it to some extent, but not fully. Well, maybe this is a bit. There is also another thing here. Those who die by disease, they are primarily perceived by relatives. But those who die a violent death, they are perceived also by relatives, but very much by strangers also. Well, these are violent. Well, anyway, shall we make a break, or shall we just stop, or?
I think we need a break.
Need a break at least.
20 minutes?
Yes.
Så 5 minuter säger vi.
Lot of equipment here. Yes, but yes. So, but those who die violently, they are also perceived by relatives. You remember that there were 70% were died by disease, and 30% by violently. So this sort of is about the right percentage, a little more who die violently. But by people who are by strangers, I think that's better. Yes, by strangers. Yeah. There we have this strange thing that a high percentage of those who die violently, they are seen by strangers, by people who do not know them. And those who die violently, they are seen much more often than they should be compared to the number of those who die violently compared in relation to those who die by disease. So it seems that with the relatives, it's sort of they have the right quota, the violent deaths. But with strangers, they just burst in on them. We can say, they are really sort of zoom on them and are observed by them very much. Then we asked also about if the apparition expressed any purpose, did they say something, did they bring any information, did they reveal anything that was not known to the perceiver. And they didn't often do that. Most of these apparitions seem to be just someone is seen and that's it. It doesn't carry much meaning. Sometimes the relatives say they showed themselves just to let us know that they were still there, they were still living. But there was no specific purpose. But there was sometimes, sometimes there were cases of saving, like seamen reported that quite a number of times, and things like that. And sometimes also of healing that took place after this contact. So they were also...
Can I ask one thing here? These cases where there is some kind of interaction.
Yes.
Not just a one-way communication, but is there, some kind of conversation?
No. There is almost
a message delivered or something like that.
Yeah, there is. It seems to be almost always just one way. There is a person appears, a person says something, but not sort of give and take back and forth. No, I don't think so. Maybe sometimes between widows and widowers, but then it is nothing we can really verify or.
To follow up on Janne's question then, do the apparitions, do they wave or do any make any hand signs or have anybody reported anything like that?
I don't remember any waving. I think there might be.
We make ourselves known to somebody else.
Yeah.
Lots of people,
I read to you the case of the
very human.
of the man who walked towards his towards the door we had, and then he pointed to the. That is a sign. There are signs there. Yes, but there is not someone reporting back, and then that one giving another sign. No.
Isn't it in Iceland a difference between acting and non-acting ghosts? Gengångare or?
I don't think I can say so. Well, we had there were some ghosts we can say who were associated with places. Someone who was seen at this particular place by more than one person, but at different times. Like the man who was seen walking in front of the machine, that particular person had appeared to more people. So there are cases like that. And then there are some cases also where someone is observed who and is sometimes observed with a particular person. When a particular person comes on a visit or is somehow associated with a particular person. Yes, a fylgja, we say. Yes. Well, maybe. Then I mentioned to you sometimes, this is collective encounters, more than one observer of an apparition. Another person present in 50% of the cases. The person was not alone, there was also someone else there. And then I asked, was that person in a position to observe the apparition? That person might be turning away, he might be asleep, or who knows what. And in 26% of the cases, or half of those, it was like that. But sometimes the and in 30% of the cases, someone who was present actually made the same observation. Like the two brothers who entered the house and heard the old man walking upstairs. There were two of them. They heard the same thing. So there were 13% of cases, or 42, reported of that kind. And whenever we had a case of that kind, we tried to interview that other witness. Well, 10 of them were no longer available. Either they had died or they had moved away. We couldn't trace them. But anyway, we interviewed 32 of those second witnesses, and of them, these 32, the testimony of the original witness was confirmed by 23. So that is 72%. So, but 3 told us they did not remember the case, or they had observed it differently compared to the person who reported it to us. And some were in doubt about this incident and so on. So we had several cases, or 23 of them, where there was a second witness and it confirmed the testimony of the first witness.
Do I understand these figures correctly? If it means that none of the second witnesses testified differently?
No, none of them testified differently. Well, 3 did not remember, yes, or observed differently. Sorry, very few, but still 3, and 6 were in doubt. Or we were in doubt if the testimony should be considered a confirmation or not, or if the person was referring to the same incident and so on.
So there's an ambiguity.
There's ambiguity there.
Okay, so there is at most then 3 cases where it may have been different.
Yes,
okay.
yes. Well, I think we will now come to the end of this. And, well, it's not very good to see. Yes. The British asked, are apparitions anything more than hallucinations? They would term them hallucinations. But are they more? Is there anything in them that could let us know that they are something else than a mere hallucination? And the arguments were given were mostly that sometimes there is more than one observer, like in the case of the 2 brothers, he and the old man. It is unlikely they had been both hallucinating. So that's the argument. If there are more than one observer, it is less likely it's purely an hallucinatory experience. Yes, and then secondly, sometimes someone sees a person and then he gives that description to a person and then the person is identified, like with the man who walked across the machine. Then he was described to the other people working and they said, this is the man, we know this man. So that shows some sort of a meaningful hallucination. It is not just a chance hallucination, it is a visionary experience of a particular person. And that is then really not an hallucination, or it is, as the British say, it is a veridical hallucination. It is an hallucination with a kernel of truth in it. It's a hallucination, namely physically there's nothing there that's perceived, but the image that people get has some truth in it. It is an image of a particular person who existed at a certain place and is known. So that is that shows something that is that shows that apparitions are not just hallucinations. Yeah, and then we come to this thing that why do we have so many hallucinations or many apparitions about the time people die? That is still an unsolved question. Why are there so many at that time? many more than at other times. And that we that was found in Britain, that we now found in Iceland. And then another thing here that I already mentioned: why are there so many apparitions of persons who died violently? And by the way, those persons who are seen at the time they die, in the majority of instances, people do not know that they were in danger of dying or that they were likely to die. Yes, so why so many cases of violent deaths that are observed? So this brought the British to create two new words: veridical hallucinations, and hallucinations with a truthful element in them. And then they also spoke about crisis apparitions, that apparitions often occur at the time some crisis or some death takes place. So.
And in this concept of crisis apparitions, does that also include a crisis for the perceiver? I'm thinking of this, you told of this seaman who was saved into a...
Well, I think there are both kinds. It can mean a crisis occurring to the, a death that is important or painful to the perceiver, but it is also sometimes a death that is sort of not really of emotional importance to the perceiver. Like, let us say, the case of the woman who perceived the smell of alcohol. She had never seen the man, and the man was not at all important to her, nor was the man important to her husband. So it's both kinds. Yeah. Maybe, yes. May I tell you one story? Because it's about a famous man. You know that Carl Gustav Jung, he wrote an autobiography, very interesting autobiography to read. And he describes one experience which he thought was quite remarkable. It is, we might put it in the category of apparitions, or we might not. But it is like an apparition. One night he was going to bed, and then he suddenly sees near his bed in his room, with his inner eye, not physically, a friend of his who had died. And I think that friend was Pauli, the man he wrote the book with on synchronicity. But that's not important. So he sees this man coming to his bed, and the man wants him to go out with him. Well, he, of course, being a psychiatrist, he knew, well, this is almost a hallucination. So he sort of thinks what to do. So he says, well, I will play the game with you. I will pretend that I go with you. So he sort of, in his mind, he follows the man. They go out through the city and to the home of this particular man. And then he walks into his library, which Carl Jung didn't know. And it's full of books, of shelves. And he goes to the one corner of the room where there are shelves up to the top. And then he takes a chair, I think it was like that, and walk up a few stairs and goes to 3 volumes of red books, 3 books bound in red. And he picks out one of these books. And there he just disappeared. The whole thing disappeared. So Carl Gustav Jung, he thought about this, and he went to his wife later and asked if he could see the library. So he enters the library, and there he sees the 3 volumes on this particular shelf in his library. So he takes out the volume that the man had taken out, and then he opens the book, and it was a novel, but the title of the book was Legacy of the Dead, Vermächtnis der Toten in German. So and that was for Jung a very important message from this particular man, that he was showing him that that he was still there, or that he had a message for him. So that's interesting. But I was particularly interested in because it happened to Carl Gustav Jung. So we have there are cases of this kind. Yes. Well, there are more cases. Or if I may tell you one case that I studied in India, very different place. We were then making a study of deathbed visions, and we went into many hospitals to speak to physicians and nurses, and we would usually have a meeting with them and tell them what we wanted. If they had observed a patient hallucinating near the time of death. And then after one meeting, one young physician, a lady, comes up to me and tells she doesn't have this sort of experience, but she has something else. And then she tells me about it, and it was like that. Her friend, who, by the way, who worked in another hospital, was also a physician, but older. She was very sick after childbirth, and she was lying with fever, really very sick. So this particular day, it was Saturday, she decides to spend the time with a friend, that older physician, in the afternoon, just to be at the bedside because she was very sick. And when she comes there, the mother of the sick woman is also sitting there. And then they sit silently, and because the woman was with high fever. And then the woman with the high fever becomes a little restless and turns around, and then she says to this young physician, her name was Kirti, "You should go home. You should go home." But Kirti says, "No, I'm going to spend the afternoon with you." But this sick woman insists, "You should go home." And then in the end, the Kirti tells her, "Well, I will call home to see if everything is all right, but there's no reason for me to go home." So she calls home. Then she learns that her grandfather, this woman, she lived with her grandmother and grandfather. He had just passed away, just now. And then, so she goes home immediately. And then, when she meets the older physician again, she asked her what happened. Then she tells that when she was lying in bed, she certainly sees her grandfather at the end of her bed. And the grandfather says, "Bring my daughter home." He always called the young one her daughter. And she knew she was having high fever and felt she was just hallucinating. So she turns to the side away from seeing that woman. But then the old man comes also here, and he repeats, "Send my daughter home." And then she starts to tell the young Kirti to go home. And when she calls, her grandfather had just died. So, and this is a case like that was also discovered by the British. And they called it cases of the bystander type. And the cases of the bystander type. Cases, yes, bystander. And here we have a case where someone wants to give a message, apparently cannot give it to the person that she wants to give the message, namely to the young Kirti, but the woman who is sick and feverish, he is able to receive it, and then she then gives the message to the person who should get it. cases of that kind are very interesting because they show a purpose, and that is meaningful to a person, not particular to the person who perceives it, but to another person who is present. But the woman who was sick, she hardly knew the old man. She had seen him also twice, but she had no relationship to him, and so on. Well, that was an interesting case. But anyway, I could tell you lots of cases, but maybe enough for now. Yes. Well, well, maybe I ask, some people sometimes ask me if I had experienced anything. So, well, shall we? Yeah, we take this on. Yeah. Well, I can't say that I have experienced, but maybe I tell you one experience which I had when I was a student. I was in Copenhagen one winter, I think in 55, 56. And then I rented a room from a landlady. And then after maybe you disconnect this thing. Yeah. Yes. Then after, then when I started to live there, then I would often see in my mind, like Carl Gustav Jung, that there was coming a man to the door. He seemed to open the door and look. And I saw him there sort of